Фашизм та геноцид в Україні. Сьогодні в Українському культурному центрі OMNI відбувається дискусія за участю професора, доктора Тараса Кузьо.
Vladimir Putin is a psychopath, sociopath, whatever word you want to call it in that genre, with absolutely no care in the world for the lives of Ukrainians and for the life of his own people. The current death rate of Russian soldiers is about 85,000, plus usually 2 to 3 times more wounded. I don't want to call him, I nearly called him a gentleman, this person is pure evil, and his regime is stagnant, corrupt, and a Stalinized Russian system. He's facing, and so when we think of that, this is literally, without any debate, a war between good and evil.
Що найважливішого з акцентів цієї війни має знати іноземна аудиторія, аби допомогти зараз Україні в цей дуже складний час?
Прем'єр Труду має повернутися з канікули і якраз підтримати Україну нарешті, бо він дотепер не підтримував Україну. Якраз тут велика міфологія була завжди, що українська діаспора в Канаді дуже впливова і так далі. Але ми це побачили, що уряд Трудо дуже мало допомагало Україну. І я навіть побачив опитування кілька місяців тому, де питали українців, які країни вас найбільше підтримали. Десь 65% сказали Сполучені Штати Америки, Великій Британії і так далі. Тільки 3% сказали Канаду. 3. Не видно канадську техніку, військова техніка, не видно їх в тій війні. Де вона є, я не знаю. Може вони допомагають по-іншому, як фінансово, для уряду, наприклад, фінансову допомогу. Але і часто чуєте, що відповідь в Канаді, що взагалі канадська армія не має багато, щоб навіть дати Україну. Я би сказав, що це брехня, бо хоч, може, Канада не має, але деякі люди кажуть, що є. Навіть як вона не має, вона має фінанси, щоб десь піти і купити, і тоді передати в Україну. І тут мені здається, що прем'єр Трудо, він занадто слабенький в тій війні. Він міг би бути набагато кращий, як, наприклад, Байден чи Джонсон, але він дуже слабенький стався. І це дивно, бо ми, українці, подумали, що буде набагато більше підтримку з Канади.
A big proportion of the Ukrainian diaspora came from Western Ukraine. They were Ukrainian speakers. Because of history, because of colonization, because of Russification, a large number of people in Ukraine spoke Russian. Again, it's not surprising. I grew up in Britain. A lot of Irish people don't speak Gaelic. They speak English. In fact, there are more Irish people in England than there are in Ireland. And as for St. Patrick's Day, even more so. But Zelensky is also symbolically important because he's a Russian-speaking Jewish person from eastern Ukraine. I mean, that already has tremendous symbolism, and it shows to what degree we in the Ukrainian diaspora need to accept that a huge proportion, absolute majority of Ukraine's Russian speakers are loyal Ukrainian patriots. This is an interesting example. This is the map of Ukraine prior to the invasion. The highest number of military casualties were East Ukrainians. That's Dnipropetrovsk. That's Zelensky's region. And when I went 5 times to the war front prior to the invasion, to the so-called ATO, the anti-terrorist operation, never thought in my life I'd be wearing a flak jacket and helmet, but there you are. I saw many Russian speakers fighting for Ukraine. So I think that's an important factor, and it shows to what degree Ukraine is a tolerant, modern European country where the propaganda that's thrown at it by Russia is simply out of place. Why the invasion happened. Putin didn't just suddenly think about this overnight. This has been a gestication, been an evolution since the Orange Revolution of 2004. And this is one of on the left, you'll see a map of Ukraine produced by Russian election consultants for Viktor Yanukovych, then the pro-Russian presidential candidate. What to me is interesting is to what degree that map is so similar to this. What it's basically saying is that Ukraine's a fictitious country. Because this is the Russian nationalist view, that you've got New Russia, Little Russia, and then these crazy West Ukrainians. The Russian nationalists don't want those West Ukrainians. And this is the same thing. They've done the same thing here. They've put the West Ukrainians there as the best, number one. Number two, the sort of Little Russians. And then these poor, allegedly poorly repressed Eastern. So this goes back as far back as 2004, this mentality that somehow Ukraine is this kind of fake, artificial kind of country. After the Orange Revolution, what happens is that Russian nationalism begins to reincorporate, rehabilitate, revive these white Russian emigres. You probably had some in Canada, but they all came here to the West in the 1920s and 30s, particularly to places like Paris. They tended to be all fascists, anti-Semites, and they all denied the existence of Ukrainians. Putin, they do musical chairs. Putin becomes prime minister for a few years, and he gets it into his head that he is going to go into Russian history as the so-called gatherer of Russian lands. By Russian here, he means Eastern Slavic. And he begins to implement that when he comes back to power as the president in 2012. That continuous pressure between 2012 and 2013 on Ukraine led, as we know, to Yanukovych backing off. And then when he backed off, that led to that popular uprising we know as the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity. Putin's goal was to get Yanukovych to turn his back on Europe, to become re-elected, and then to take Ukraine into the Eurasian Union. Because for Putin, the core countries of that Eurasian Union are these Eastern Slavs, the Russian world. Ukraine, Russia, Belarus. When Putin publishes his 6,000 word essay in the summer of 2021, that's de facto Putin's Mein Kampf. Because that's the same month that they decide to invade Ukraine. This is now when the good stuff starts to happen. Because, and this is where this slide is important, finally, they don't quite figure out Ukraine isn't Little Russia and Ukraine is not Russia. I have yet to find somebody in Moscow who actually understands Ukraine, who gets it. That because you can't understand the country if you just have stereotypes about the country. I often joke, and I love this, that Ukraine has had 3 revolutions since 1990. The last Russian Revolution was in 1917. Ukrainians have become citizens, without any exaggeration. They have agency. They feel they have power. That's reflected in the massive, and I'm not exaggerating, massive volunteer movement, massive civil society, and this volunteer movement is literally from children on the street corners. It's actually very moving, singing and collecting money for soldiers, to old age pensioners at the age of 80, 85, giving their life savings.
Що має змінитися? Що має переламатися, аби хід цієї війни змінився?
Ну, я думаю, що зима буде допомагати більше українців чи українських солдатів, ніж вона буде допомагати російським солдатам. Українські солдати, вони будуть приготовлені до зими. Вони будуть мати теплі одяги, можуть десь тепло жити, ночувати, харчування попросту. І також вони будуть мати допомогу людей, де вони живуть, якраз бо вони вважають їм просто своїх. Російські солдати не будуть мати нічого. Ну, це, що вони до мобілізації вони нічого не мали, і вони були дуже погано приготовлені, вони просто дуже погано взагалі були забезпечені. Після мобілізації ще гірші, набагато ще гірші. І на превеликий жаль, російська влада це не дбає про них, і вони їх називають як м'ясо, фактично як м'ясо. Вони не будуть мати теплий одяг, вони не будуть мати де тепло ночувати, і вони не будуть, і населення буде проти них. Це означає, що зима буде дуже погано для них, і я сумніваюся, що вони дотримуються як збройні сили, які можуть по-справжньому воювати. І я сумніваюся, що десь в січні, в лютому вони взагалі зможуть щось робити, бо їм просто не буде ніяке забезпечення, вони будуть страшенно зимно. І, як ми знаємо, москалі люблять пити, це все буде їм ще гірше. Я думаю, що тут якраз це буде на користь України. Бо це не є правда, що в зимі не можна воювати. Проблеми є, коли є болото. Але коли земля є заморозена, то тоді танки і бронова техніка можна їхати і воювати. Я думаю, що тут якраз, мені здається, що до кінця зими і початок весни Україна буде в кращому ситуації.
I think, when people think of winter, they usually think it works in Russia's favor, but they tend to forget Finland. Yes, in World War II against the Nazis and against Napoleon, it did work in their favor. This time is going to work against Russia's favor. Ukrainian forces will have already winter clothing, winter shelter, good supplies, food, hot food, and support of the local people. Very important. The Russians have none of that. One reason being, massive corruption in Russia. And I think, we have to understand there's corruption and there's a mafia state. They're two different things. Every country has corruption. Let's not be naive about this, including Western democracies. You can call it other things, consultancy fees, whatever you want to call it. Presents. My mother's Italian, so I know a lot about this thing. And you do, as Canadians, you've got Quebec. So, but, Ukraine, yes, there was corruption, but Russia was a mafia state. And the definition of a mafia state is when there's no difference between organized crime and the state. They're one and the same thing. When these so-called Western experts predicted that, in the same way as Moscow, that Ukraine would only last 2 or 3 days, they exaggerated the power of the Russian military and completely ignored the fact that if Russia's a mafia state, then that's going to have an impact on Russian military. How can it not have an impact? And the Russian security services. And that means you've had terrible logistics. There's incredible, you have these military geeks on Twitter who collect this stuff. I don't know when they ever sleep. And I just keep downloading this stuff because it's just incredibly interesting. But just the examples are just incredible, like being issued with medical kit from 1978. That medical stuff is useless. Being issued with 5 years out of date food. Tanks arriving where everything's been stripped inside. Everything. All the optics have been sold off. Now, if Russia couldn't provide the logistics for the 175,000 that invaded initially, how can they provide logistics for the 300,000 that just mobilized? Obviously, they can't. And again, if you go to social media, you'll see all these videos of these Russian mobilized soldiers be literally dumped in a forest with no tents, nothing, and said, fend for yourselves whilst we sort this out. So there'll be no logistics for those Russian soldiers, no winter clothing, no food. It was bad enough for them when they were occupying Kiev in February, March. They had to beg for food or go and steal it from shops, and many of them caught hypothermia. By the way, they were completely stunned at how well Ukrainians lived compared to them. So I think the winter time is going to have a tremendous impact. I'd be surprised if the Russian army is able to be a real fighting force by the end of this winter. Because knowing Russians, they'll probably drink a lot of vodka, thinking that will warm them up, but it won't warm you up in the cold of winter. It'll do the opposite. And they like to drink other things besides vodka, like turpentine and floor cleaner and stuff. That combined with poor logistics, thievery, massive corruption, often like tins of meat that's supposed to be arriving to the frontline troops are stolen along the way, and then the soldiers at the front have to buy it back from them. Low morale. I mean, all this will feeding together. I mean, even some of the weapons issued to these new mobilized soldiers are just incredible, like 1970s or 1960s Kalashnikovs that barely work. I mean, you put that up against the weapons that Ukrainian forces are receiving, they've got no chance. So winter conditions. Putin has now lost 3 campaigns: Kiev, Kharkiv, and Kherson. I think the next target has to be, I think where Ukrainians will be trying to break through over the winter period, is going to be the eastern part of Kherson and the southern part of Zaporizhia. Now, it's wrong to think that you can't fight in winter. When it's muddy, which is now, before the snow comes, yes, it's more difficult. Muddy doesn't really help. But when the ground's frozen, tanks and APCs can move on frozen ground. So I don't think that will necessarily stop it. The reason why Putin and Russia are launching these horrible strikes against Ukrainian utilities to try and freeze out Ukrainians over winter is because they're too scared to face Ukrainian troops on the ground. It's as simple as that. Because the attrition rate for Russian soldiers is again huge. Again, just look on social media, the amount of Russian killed is just, the battlefield is littered with them, especially in the Donbass region. So I think this is going to be a crucial time. From the viewpoint of Ukraine, the war there should be an attempt to end the war as quickly as possible. Because not only the destruction that Russia is bringing, but hopefully that will decrease with more and more air defenses coming to Ukraine, and thereby covering the whole of the country, but also the costs involved. I mean, Ukraine needs something like $5 billion a month to plug the government budget deficit, and that's coming from the West. So it's a lot of money. In contrast, Putin and Russia want the war to drag on. They're just going to throw cannon fodder at the Ukrainians. They don't care how many get killed. And they also hoping that Western governments will have fatigue and then just say, no, we can't continue this. You need to negotiate some deal. Now, if the prediction is true and Ukraine is successful in liberating the rest of Kherson and southern Zaporizhia, what that means is that Ukrainian or Western military equipment in the hands of Ukrainians will be on the Black Sea coast, and the entire Crimea is within range. That will, I think, spark panic. Lawrence Friedman, I recommend him if you can find him. He publishes a kind of a blog about every two weeks. He's a retired professor from King's College. Very, very good. And in his last one, he said that Putin doesn't look like he wants to, despite the defeats, doesn't look like he wants to negotiate. But if Ukrainians are threatening Crimea, that might change his mind. Because Crimea is different for the Russian nationalist mindset to Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Donbass. So I think this will be, it'll be, I think, a difficult time for Ukrainian civilians, a better time for Ukrainian soldiers, but hopefully an even worse one for Russian soldiers.
Аби злочини Росії припинилися, Україна та світ мають не мовчати. Сьогоднішня дискусія – ще одна нагода поговорити про російсько-українську війну та обговорити її наслідки для цілого світу. Роксолана Буяк, Костянтин Сніцар, Форум ТВ, Торонто.